Hey guys, Zane from the Infinite Jukebox here with another album review, and today I wanted to talk about the new Lil Durk record, Almost Healed. Lil Durk is an interesting case regarding the role that he plays in the current rap landscape. I mean, he first debuted over a decade ago at this point with his first initial mixtapes, but it kinda only feels like Durk has started peaking within the last couple of years, give or take. At least, I would argue that that's the general consensus of most of his audience, anyways. Despite the fact that he does admittedly have a lot of pretty heavy musical ambitions regarding combining R&B with trap, or collaborating with a ton of different artists, or even founding the Only the Family music collective slash record label that manages to make a pretty decent sized wave within the music industry as a whole on a fairly regular basis, he's really been nothing more than just a normal trap based rapper. I don't really know how to put it other than the fact that he is a completely average, regular guy. And that's not a bad thing or anything like that, but it also doesn't really define a great career. I mean, he doesn't bring anything to the table to really make him stand out as a particularly great rapper or anything like that, but at the same time, he bears enough similarities to most of his less than noteworthy peers without really shifting into a worse lane to be a standout in a more negative sense, so Lil Durk just kind of exists and floats along freely, releasing either mediocre or pretty decent-ish albums on a very regular basis. I mean, I have nothing but respect for the guy's hustle. He releases music almost constantly, but none of it is really all that great. In fact, none of it's really even all that good. Despite the fact that this is still a very, very flawed record and far from a great one, Almost Healed still represents nearly everything that Lil Durk should have been on some of his past records. From a tonal and lyrical perspective, there are times where Almost Healed can feel a bit unexpected, coming from Lil Durk in particular. I mean, he always has been a somewhat more personable rapper in some of his lyrical content, but nonetheless, Almost Healed feels like a deeper step in that direction. The album opening spoken word interlude therapy session, which features Alicia Keys playing Lil Durk's therapist, leaving a voice message for him, really kinda immediately sets the tone for the album as a whole, as he really takes some pretty major strides in a direction more relating to personal problems and things that are vague enough to be relatable, yet still specific enough to directly be about Lil Durk himself. He's obviously rapping about his own experiences here, but nonetheless he does so in a clever way that's easy to appeal for a number of people. And there are actually a number of times where I would downright call him introspective. Songs like Never Again see Durk really expertly explore a lot of themes relating to personal heartbreak, loss, and demons that he's fighting on his own time when he's not making music. And ultimately, that's something that I have nothing but love and even admiration for. I mean, sure, I'm not going to say that these are the most poetic lyrics ever put to tape or anything like that, and there are times where there are tracks like At This Point We Stuck that are executed in a bit more of a clunky and less professional sounding way, but nonetheless, as a whole, I have to say that this is a pretty great improvement for Lil Durk on a lyrical scale at the very least. Again, there are some admittedly lesser tracks here, though this often more has to do with the fact that some songs just tread territory that's been gone over and over time and time again by a number of different trap artists, rather than the fact that they're written poorly or anything relating to songwriting. And honestly, as a whole, I have to say that Lil Durk managing to make a major achievement in lyrical ability, at least in the context of his own career, is something that I personally didn't have on my 2023 rap bingo card or anything like that, and I highly doubt most other people did either. The instrumentals and beats are somewhat similar to the lyricism throughout Almost Healed, as in their best moments they are genuinely great, and in their worst moments they're never bad, they're just kind of frustratingly mediocre. In a way, it's actually kind of funny to compare certain tracks from a compositional point of view from track to track on this record, as things can go from phenomenal to just mind-numbingly uninteresting. For example, the excellent world-famous producer Metro Boomin brings a great deal of fantastic production to the track War About It that manages to beautifully complement Lil Durk's own flow, as well as a pretty great 21 Savage feature that makes for a relatively strong joint. I'm not going to say it's the best song ever made, but it's still a pretty recommendable track if you're into that particular style. There are also a couple of songs here like Drew Hill that manage to execute admittedly exaggeratedly emotional instrumentals pretty well. They don't feel melodramatic per se, yet at the same time they don't feel lacking in impact either. On the other hand, it kind of feels virtually impossible to recognize tracks like Grandson or Put 'em on Ice offhand. And that's not to say that these are bad songs, they're fine. In fact, they can be pretty decent at times with relatively solid verses or maybe hooks. But at the same time, they also fail to live up to the standards of melody and general song structure that some of their sister tracks set for them. It's not necessarily an inconsistency of the actual production styles, it's just an inconsistency of how the producers and the beatmakers here utilize their own styles in the context of Lil Durk and co-conspirators' abilities. Some producers here try to experiment a little bit, and those generally go over pretty well. Some producers here manage to incorporate their own unique style in a manner that suits the different musicians on different tracks. That works well too. But there are some songs here that just feel very basic. They don't really try to play to Lil Durk or any of the featured artists' own strengths, yet at the same time they don't have a particular identity relating to any of the producers behind them. And that's not to say that's true for every single track. Obviously, there are a number of incredibly talented producers behind this album. It's just that, again, it's a degree of inconsistency, not so much in the quality of the producers, but in the quality of the work that they put specifically to this album's track list. I digress, the best production-related moments of Almost Healed are incredibly strong. The features that are sprinkled throughout Almost Healed are all pretty great as well, for the most part at least, except for one, but I will touch on that in a minute. First things first, I would like to say that there practically are a perfect amount of features on this album. A lot of records similar to Almost Healed, a lot of trap-based albums especially, overload themselves with features, multiple artists on nearly every single song, and that can be kind of a disaster at times. But at the same time, there are also trap albums that have little to no features, and that can be a problem as well, especially considering that many of these records are fairly long, and ultimately there needs to be some sort of perfect balance. A lack of features can be a very bad thing, and can ultimately leave an album feeling monotonous and hollow, and an overload of features can be, well, exactly that, a bit of a sensory overload. Thankfully, though, here there is pretty much a perfect amount of features, and the vast majority of them hit just as hard as most of Lil Durk's verses as well. For example, J. Cole's brief appearance on All My Life immediately elevates that track among the entirety of the track list and causes that to pretty much be one of the biggest highlights of Lil Durk's career up to this point. I feel somewhat guilty saying that, knowing that I'm partially claiming that due to a fact that is not related to Lil Durk's own performance work, but at the same time, it's true. It's a pretty fantastic song that I would rank among Lil Durk's best out of the entirety of his discography up to this point. Future steps into the studio to drop a very solid verse on Never Imagine, the late Juice WRLD appears on Cross the Globe, and there's even that aforementioned 21 Savage feature on War About It that's pretty great, I will say. I do personally think that the J. Cole and 21 Savage verses here are among the best on the record, not to be from Durk himself, but nonetheless, pretty much every feature is solid. Even the Kodak Black feature isn't that bad. However, if you were at any point aware of this record's track list and the featured artists found on it, then there's probably a major elephant in the room that you may or may not be waiting for me to discuss. And that time has come. The one bad feature on here is absolutely just atrocious. It could be considered a crime against humanity in some parts of the world, and honestly, I think that's fair. And that is, of course, the Morgan Wallen feature on the track Stand By Me, which is obviously the lowest of the low point on this album. Even ignoring the fact that Morgan Wallen being involved with anything is just an immediate red flag for every single other musician and behind-the-scenes person involved, that song is just about as bad as anything else that Wallen has released on his own, and if you're familiar with any of Morgan Wallen's music, or just the fact that I do not like the man, which I think I've gotten across pretty clearly at this point, that is not a compliment. I mean, look, Morgan Wallen has released one of the worst albums of the year thus far with his major hit, at least in the United States, One Thing at a Time, and he brings that consistent same level of awfulness to Lil Durk's project. I would actually consider it cruel torture level behavior if it weren't for the fact that Lil Durk probably invited Wallen himself to be on the album. I would personally like to think that Morgan Wallen just kicked down the studio door and tied Lil Durk to a chair and did his appearance and then just kind of vanished and then maybe blackmailed him to convince him to put it on the album. But I know that's unfortunately not true, though that would really be the preferable option. But the truth is, it's just a horrible creative decision. Morgan Wallen has no place on this album, and again, like I said at the beginning of this video, Lil Durk has been known to collaborate with a variety of different artists, and I can appreciate the fact that he wanted to collab with someone from a completely different musical background. I really can. But Morgan Wallen. Morgan fucking Wallen. Look, I'm not saying that Lil Durk needed to go to the underground of, like, alternative country music and find, like, Dougie Poole and collaborate with him or anything like that, but at the same time, who thought that was a good idea? It truly does result in Stand By Me, one of the worst songs on the album, one of the worst songs I've heard all year thus far. Everything about it is awful. Morgan Wallen's incredibly poorly digitally retuned vocals, the disgustingly synthetic instrumental on an album that's otherwise filled with beats that range from solid to really good. It's just a disaster of a track, and about as much of a disaster piece as you can possibly get without it being even remotely entertaining. I digress. Most of the features on Almost Healed that aren't by trashy country musicians are actually above average, and it's just that one Morgan Wallen song that just ruins everything. Thankfully, it's the second to last track on the album, so it doesn't destroy the momentum of the record per se, but for what it's worth, it does admittedly drag down the album quite a bit, and considering it's just one song, and not a very long song at that, that's kind of an impressive feat in a way. I guess. I'm not sure how I feel about that, actually. If you couldn't tell, I think Morgan Wallen's a bad musician. All of that being set aside, the true biggest issue that's found throughout Almost Healed is just the fact that it still feels bloated, even despite the fact that it does elevate many of the different qualities that have defined Lil Durk's career up to this point. For every good or even nearly great song on here, like Never Imagined, or sad songs that I would hugely recommend to anyone who thinks they may possibly click with Lil Durk's sound, there's another song like Belt to Ass that just kind of makes you wonder what the point of their inclusion was in the first place. They are inherently bad songs, but they just don't need to exist. I mean, they don't really bring anything new to the table topically, they don't really develop the album in any way musically or aesthetically, they just kind of exist and add a longer runtime to the album that is simply not needed. And it does ultimately feel kinda weird to refer to an album that runs for under an hour as a bloated record that has too many filler tracks, but ultimately, that is the truth, at least about Almost Healed. And I do want to say that Almost Healed does make a number of successful stabs at turning Lil Durk into even more of a personable and impressive performer. It just so happens that every successful stab is, generally speaking, accompanied by a miss. Either a relative miss, or just a complete, total 100%, not even remotely close to being near the target miss. Look, Almost Healed is far from a perfect project, and to be totally honest, I doubt it's something that many will return to, at least not in the way of listening to it from front to back, because the truth is that most of this album doesn't necessarily need to exist, or at least a good chunk, half of it, give or take. It's just a record filled to the brim with a lot of filler, despite the fact that there are a number of tracks on here that are strong enough to be considered among Lil Durk's best so far, which is saying something considering the fact that he has, again, been in the game for over a decade at this point. Even still, you can tell that Durk is continuing to hone his craft and just make better work as a whole. I mean, there's some great bits of lyricism from him here, there's some strong beats and instrumentals from a number of incredibly talented producers, and there are even some great features that aren't by Morgan Wallen as well. I mean, hey, it may not be a masterpiece, but Almost Healed is still a solid album from Lil Durk as he continues to still find his footing in his own unique voice in his particular field and niche in the entirety of the rap landscape. I'm going to give this record 3 stars out of 5. And with that being said, that is the end of this album review. I've been Zane from the Infinite Jukebox. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.